A black CEO, dressed in casual attire and flying incognito, was ready to board his flight when everything changed. At the gate, a flight attendant accused him of faking his first-class ticket and tore it up in front of everyone, humiliating him on the spot. But just 10 minutes later, her life took a turn she never expected when the truth came out. What happened next shocked the entire airport and sparked a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible moments like this. The airport buzzed with its usual symphony of movement, heels clicking on polished floors, muffled announcements cutting through the air, and the occasional laughter of travelers who had managed to hold on to some shred of joy. Darius Montgomery moved through the throng with an air of quiet confidence. At 58, he had learned the art of patience. His suit was immaculate, his posture upright, yet his steps carried the burden of experience. A lifetime of knowing that to some people. His skin spoke louder than his accomplishments. Darius wasn't new to flying first class. Years of hard work had carved him a seat at tables where his presence once seemed unimaginable. Yet the memory of starting out with nothing, scrubbing floors as a teenager in his father's hardware store, remained vivid. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was armor. He carried those memories like talismans, reminders of how far he'd come and the battles he still might face. As he approached the gate, his eyes fell on the sign, "First Class Boarding." For a moment, he let himself exhale, imagining the comfort of his seat, the quiet hours ahead, and the important meeting waiting for him on the other side of the country. He handed his ticket to the gate attendant, a young woman with sharp features and a crisp uniform that seemed to mirror her demeanor. Her glance was fleeting but deliberate. She looked him up and down, her expression tightening into something Darius had seen countless times before. It wasn't the outright hostility of slurs or raised fists. No, this was quieter, more insidious, the kind of skepticism that seeped into your bones, planting doubts about your place in the world. "This line is for first-class passengers," she said curtly, her tone somewhere between correction and dismissal. Darius paused, his years of experience telling him to weigh his words. He could feel the tension between them, the quiet challenge embedded in her gaze. He nodded, not bothering to explain, and handed her the ticket. Her fingers snatched it from his hand, as if offended by its very existence. She glanced at it, then muttered, "This must be a mistake." Before Darius could respond, she tore it in two. The sound was sharp, deliberate, a statement louder than any words she could have spoken. Darius blinked, his shock tempered by the weariness of familiarity. Around them, the murmurs began, passengers turning to look, their curiosity mingling with unease. "Excuse me," Darius said, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you do that?" The gate attendant's lips curled into a smirk, her confidence bolstered by the uniform on her back. "You don't belong here," she said simply, her words cutting deeper than the torn edges of the ticket. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow. Darius could feel the heat of eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, others with silent judgment. He had been here before. In boardrooms, in restaurants, even in churches. The script rarely changed. No matter his success, no matter his dignity, there was always someone ready to question his worth. But this moment wasn't just about him. It was about the people watching, the unspoken lessons being reinforced in the hearts of bystanders. Darius took a breath, steadying himself, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of anger. He'd learned long ago that the loudest response was often silence, the kind that demanded answers. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," he said, his voice steady as stone. The attendant's smirk faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, waving him off with a dismissive hand. "You can take it up with customer service," she said, her tone dripping with indifference. The crowd around them began to shift, their whispers growing louder. "That wasn't right," someone murmured. A woman with a phone held up, recording, stepped closer. "Why'd you tear his ticket?" she asked, her voice challenging the attendant's authority. Darius stood his ground, letting the moment stretch. The weight of the scene began to press on the gate attendant, her confidence cracking under the scrutiny. Moments later, a man in uniform appeared, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. Darius stepped forward, holding up the torn pieces of his ticket. "This is the problem," he said evenly. "I had a first-class ticket." She tore it up. The supervisor's face darkened as he turned to the gate attendant. "Is this true?" she stammered, her bravado evaporating. I assumed." He raised a hand to cut her off. "We'll deal with this later," he said firmly, turning back to Darius. His tone softened. "I deeply apologize, sir. Let me get this sorted out for you." But the damage was done. Around them, phones were raised, cameras capturing the moment. Darius didn't speak further. He let the scene play out, knowing that some lessons were taught by actions, not words. As the supervisor handed him a new ticket and led him toward the lounge, Darius felt the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about the barriers that still existed, the silent battles waged every day. And as he sat down, he realized that this moment, like so many before it, wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The lounge was a sanctuary of muted tones, plush chairs, subdued lighting, and the faint clinking of glasses. It was a world designed to exude comfort. But Darius Montgomery couldn't shake the tension that clung to him like a second skin. The torn ticket sat in his pocket, its jagged edges a reminder of what had transpired at the gate. Around him, people whispered, their voices carrying the faint hum of judgment. Some glanced his way, their eyes flickering with curiosity or guilt before quickly looking away. Others stared openly, their expressions caught somewhere between sympathy and discomfort. Darius sat down, his posture calm, but his mind raced. The supervisor's apology still echoed in his ears, hollow and rehearsed, as though it had been plucked from a corporate handbook. The crowd at the gate had scattered, their interest waning now that the spectacle was over. Yet, the incident lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. A woman seated nearby leaned toward her companion. "Did you see what happened at the gate?" she murmured, her voice low but not low enough. Her companion, a man with silver hair and a stiff demeanor, shrugged. "Probably some kind of misunderstanding," he said dismissively. "People are too quick to cry discrimination these days." Darius closed his eyes for a moment, the words slicing through him with a familiarity that stung. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such reasoning, the casual dismissal of a reality he had lived his entire life. He opened his eyes, focusing on his breath, willing himself to remain steady. The young woman from the gate approached then, her phone still clutched in her hand. She was small, no older than 25, with a nervous energy that belied her courage. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw what happened back there. I recorded it, if you need it." What she did was wrong. Darius studied her for a moment, her earnestness cutting through the cynicism that had begun to harden in him. He nodded, offering a small, polite smile. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." The young woman lingered, as though searching for the right words. "It's just, people shouldn't have to deal with that," she said finally. "Especially not someone like you. Someone like me." The phrase hung in the air, unspoken questions swirling beneath it. Darius wondered if she meant his suit, his demeanor, the way he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to success. Did she see him as the exception to the rule, or did she see the rule itself? Before he could respond, she nodded and walked away, her phone still glowing faintly in her hand. The lounge grew quieter, the initial buzz of the incident at the gate fading into the background. Yet, Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a torn ticket. It was about the layers of assumptions and biases that lay beneath it. The quiet ways racism seeped into everyday life. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks to the passengers. When she reached Darius, she hesitated for just a second, a barely perceptible pause, but it was there. Her smile was tight, her tone overly polite. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked. Darius declined with a nod. But the moment stayed with him. It was another reminder of how subtle these moments could be, how they built upon one another like bricks in an invisible wall. As he sat there, the torn ticket still in his pocket, Darius felt a quiet resolve forming within him. He thought about his parents, about the lessons they had taught him growing up in a world that often saw his worth as conditional. They had taught him to hold his head high, to meet prejudice with dignity but never with silence. He looked around the lounge, his gaze settling on the faces of those who had witnessed the incident. Some had spoken up, like the young woman. Others had remained silent, their discomfort hidden behind lowered eyes or hurried steps. The mumbled excuses of the man with silver hair still echoed in his mind. Misunderstanding. Too quick to cry discrimination. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something deeper. Something woven into the fabric of the world they all lived in. And as Darius sat there, he realized that his response to this moment would not just be about him. It would be about the message he left behind for the people watching. For the ones who didn't yet have the courage to speak. Moments like these weren't just challenges, they were choices. And Darius Montgomery had no intention of letting this moment pass without meaning. The boarding process was a parade of controlled chaos, children clinging to parents, businessmen juggling phones and briefcases, and flight attendants herding passengers like sheep toward their assigned rows. Darius Montgomery stepped onto the plane with measured steps, holding his reissued ticket in one hand and the remnants of his dignity in the other. The supervisor from the gate, James Lindley, was by his side, his apologies flowing like a weak river after a storm. "We've ensured everything is sorted, Mr. Montgomery," he said, his voice carefully polished, his tone just short of pleading. "Please, let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Darius nodded, offering nothing but a polite, "Thank you." He had learned long ago that such apologies were more for their sake than his. They wanted reassurance that the damage could be undone, that the wound could heal as though it had never been inflicted. But he knew better. As he made his way to his seat, the eyes of other passengers followed him. Some were brief, casual glances, but others lingered, their curiosity sharpened by what they had seen or heard in the lounge. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress nudged her husband, whispering something that drew a small frown to his lips. Darius settled into his first-class seat, its soft leather a bitter contrast to the tension still coiled within him. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly through the cabin as the boarding continued. Around him, the small rituals of flight began, passengers stowing bags, flipping through magazines, adjusting their headrests. But even here, in this space designed for comfort and exclusivity, the subtle dance of prejudice persisted. The flight attendant serving first class, a man in his 30s with a neatly pressed uniform and a smile that barely reached his eyes, paused at Darius's row. "May I take your coat, sir?" he asked, his tone professional but clipped. "No, thank you," Darius replied evenly. The attendant hesitated for a moment too long, his gaze flickering over Darius as if searching for something to validate his presence in this seat. Then he moved on, his demeanor loosening slightly with the next passenger, a white man in a casual blazer who was greeted with a broad smile and easy conversation. Darius exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the armrest. He wasn't surprised, but the repetition of such moments, the quiet exclusions, the subtle dismissals always managed to sting. It wasn't the overt acts of racism that wore him down. It was this, the endless accumulation of small slights, each one a pebble added to a mountain no one else seemed to see. As the plane taxied to the runway, the cabin lights dimmed, and the atmosphere shifted. Darius turned his gaze to the window, watching the world outside shrink into lines and shapes as the aircraft ascended. The clouds spread like a blanket beneath them, their pristine whiteness a sharp contrast to the turbulence within him. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the flight attendant returned, this time with a beverage cart. Darius declined again, his appetite soured by the events of the day. As the attendant moved past him, Darius caught the faintest glance, a flicker of something between discomfort and annoyance. It was fleeting, but it was there. The hours stretched on, the plane cutting through the sky like a blade through fabric. Around Darius, his fellow passengers settled into their routines, laptops opened, movies played, wine glasses clinked. Yet, he felt detached, as if watching it all from a distance. His thoughts returned to the gate, to the torn ticket and the faces in the lounge. He thought of the young woman with the phone, her bravery a bright spark against the backdrop of silence. He thought of the man who had dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, his words a shield against the discomfort of truth. And he thought of the flight attendant now serving drinks with a practiced ease, his movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. Darius wondered if the man was aware of his bias or if it had become so ingrained that it flowed through him unconsciously, like the hum of the engines beneath their feet. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his life navigating spaces like this, spaces that welcomed his money, his achievements, but questioned his presence, spaces that pretended to be blind to color but were anything but. This wasn't just a flight. It was another battle in a war that never seemed to end. A war fought not with weapons but with glances, gestures, and words that cut deeper than steel. And yet, even in this quiet conflict, there were signs of change. The young woman's recording, the murmurs of support at the gate, small acts of defiance against a system that thrived on silence. As the plane began its descent, Darius straightened in his seat, his resolve hardening. The battle wasn't over. It never truly was. But he had learned long ago that progress wasn't about winning every fight. It was about enduring, about showing up, about refusing to let the weight of prejudice crush the spirit beneath it. The plane touched down, the wheels skimming the runway with a jolt. Around him, passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Darius watched them, his expression unreadable, as the flight attendant approached with a forced smile. "Thank you for flying with us, sir," the man said, his tone too polished to be genuine. Darius met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice steady, his meaning layered. As he stepped off the plane, the airport lights gleaming around him, Darius felt the familiar weight of the world settle on his shoulders. But this time, he carried it with a quiet determination. This moment, like so many others, wasn't the end. It was a reminder of the work still to be done and of the strength it would take to do it. The terminal stretched before Darius Montgomery, a maze of glass and steel illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights. Travelers bustled past, their lives moving forward without pause. Yet Darius felt tethered to the events of the day. His reissued ticket, crumpled and creased, sat heavy in his pocket like a piece of unfinished business. As he approached the airline's customer service desk, the supervisor from earlier, James Lindley, reappeared. His demeanor was apologetic to the point of theatricality, shoulders slightly hunched, his hands clasped together as though in prayer. "Mr. Montgomery," James began, his tone carefully measured, "I'd like to extend our deepest apologies once again for what happened at the gate." Darius nodded but said nothing, forcing the man to continue. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "We've spoken with the employee involved," James added quickly, his words coming in a rush. "She's been removed from this flight and will be undergoing additional training. I assure you this matter is being taken very seriously." "Training," Darius repeated, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. He let the word hang in the air, allowing James to squirm under its weight. "Yes, sir, we believe that. Do you?" Darius interrupted, his gaze steady. "Do you believe it will make a difference? Or is this just another box to check off? Another step in a cycle that lets you tell yourself the problem is solved?" James faltered, his practiced apology unraveling. I assure you, sir, we're committed to addressing this issue thoroughly." Darius leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but growing heavier with meaning. "Addressing it," he said, "is not the same as confronting it. This wasn't an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern, a system that allows people like her to act on assumptions without consequence. Tell me, James, what do you plan to do about the system?" James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he shifted his weight uncomfortably, his polished shoes squeaking faintly against the tile floor. "Thought so," Darius said, stepping back and adjusting his coat. He wasn't angry, at least. Not anymore. Anger was a familiar heat. But what he felt now was colder, heavier. It was the exhaustion of carrying the burden of proof every day, of being expected to rise above when others sank to their lowest. As James retreated, Darius turned and made his way toward the airport lounge. He wasn't sure what he expected to find there: peace, perhaps, or at least a reprieve from the weight of the day. But what he found instead was another reminder of how deep the wounds ran. Inside the lounge, a group of businessmen sat huddled near the bar, their conversation carrying just loudly enough for Darius to hear. "Did you see that thing at the gate?" one of them said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Some guy caused a scene. And now everyone's acting like it's the airline's fault." "Yeah," another chimed in. "I mean, these days you can't say anything without someone pulling the race card." Darius froze mid-step, his hand tightening around the strap of his bag. The words weren't new, but they hit with the same force they always did. Sharp and cutting, each syllable a reminder of how quickly the blame shifted from the offender to the offended. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on the group. They didn't notice him at first, their laughter punctuating their conversation like exclamation points. But when he took a deliberate step closer, their eyes darted to him, the smiles faltering on their lips. "Excuse me," Darius said, his voice steady but loud enough to command attention. "What exactly do you mean by the race card?" The man who had spoken first, a younger man with a slick haircut and an expensive suit, cleared his throat, his bravado shrinking under Darius's scrutiny. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "Just, some people are quick to make things about race." "Some people," Darius repeated, his tone cool. "And what do you think the woman at the gate made it about when she tore up my ticket?" The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. I wasn't talking about you specifically." "Weren't you?" Darius asked, stepping closer. "Because it sounds like you're saying that acknowledging racism is more offensive than the act itself. Tell me, does that make you uncomfortable?" The man glanced at his companions for support, but they avoided his gaze, their discomfort as palpable as the tension now hanging in the air. Darius didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He turned and walked away, leaving the weight of his words to settle over them like a storm cloud. As he returned to his seat in the lounge, he caught the eye of a woman sitting nearby. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, and her expression was one of quiet understanding. She gave him a small nod, as if to say, "I see you, I hear you." Darius nodded back, grateful for the silent acknowledgement. It wasn't enough to erase the day's events, but it was a reminder that in a world full of indifference, there were still moments of connection, moments that mattered. He sat down, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. The challenges weren't over, he knew that. They never truly were. But as he rested, the torn ticket still crumpled in his pocket. Darius allowed himself a small moment of hope. The system was flawed. Yes, the challenges were endless, the weight immense, but he had faced them before, and he would face them again. Because the fight wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who came after. And for that, Darius Montgomery would keep standing, keep speaking, and keep pushing forward. The plane soared through the clouds, leaving the chaos of the ground behind. Inside the cabin, a strange kind of quiet settled in, the hum of the engines providing a backdrop for the unspoken tension that lingered between Darius Montgomery and the world around him. He sat in his first-class seat, gazing out the window at the endless stretch of blue and white. The torn ticket was no longer in his hand, but its presence clung to him like a phantom. It was a luxury, this seat, this flight, but for Darius, it was also a battlefield, a place where perceptions of wealth and privilege collided with the assumptions of those who couldn't reconcile his success with the color of his skin. The flight attendant returned, her smile now practiced and polite, though her hesitation was still there. Just beneath the surface, she poured a glass of water for the man in the row ahead of him, her movements fluid and confident. When she reached Darius, there was a pause, imperceptible to most but loud to him. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked, her voice straining under the weight of its forced courtesy. "No, thank you," Darius replied, his tone as even as he could manage. As she walked away, he couldn't help but notice how her shoulders relaxed, how her interactions with the other passengers seemed smoother, freer, as though a burden had been lifted. It was the same subtle shift he'd experienced countless times before, moments that might seem trivial to others but accumulated in his memory like stones in a jar. Around him, the cabin buzzed with quiet activity. A man in a tailored suit tapped away on his laptop, oblivious to the tension that filled the air. A woman in pearls adjusted her blanket and flipped through the pages of a glossy magazine. They all seemed untouched by the events of the day, their lives continuing seamlessly, uninterrupted by the questions and assumptions that shadowed Darius's every step. He closed his eyes, trying to let the hum of the engines drown out his thoughts. But the memory of the gate attendant's smirk and the dismissive whispers in the lounge wouldn't let him rest. It wasn't the blatant acts of racism that wore him down, it was the quiet moments like these. The ones that went unnoticed by everyone except the person they were directed at. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting him back to the present. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, instructing passengers to remain seated. Darius looked around, noticing how the sudden shake had startled some of the other passengers. For a moment, he thought about how different the reactions might be if he stood up now. If he moved toward the cockpit to check on the situation, would they see him as a concerned passenger or a threat? Would the flight attendant rush to stop him, her assumptions overriding the reality of his intentions? These questions weren't new, they were the same ones he had carried with him through airports, hotel lobbies, boardrooms, and even the sidewalks of his own neighborhood. They were the questions that lived in the pause between a stranger's glance and their decision to look away or to call for help. The turbulence passed, and the cabin settled again. But Darius's thoughts continued to churn. He opened his laptop, intending to work, but instead found himself staring at the blank screen. Words failed him, their weight too great to form. Across the aisle, an older man caught his eye. His face was lined with age, his expression unreadable. After a moment, the man spoke, his voice low but clear. "You handled yourself well back there," he said, nodding toward the general direction of the gate. Darius hesitated, unsure whether the man's words were meant as a compliment or an observation. "I've had practice," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. The man nodded again, leaning back in his seat. "You shouldn't have to," he said, almost to himself. Darius turned back to his laptop, the man's words lingering in the air between them. It was a small acknowledgement, but it carried weight, a reminder that not everyone was content to look the other way. The flight attendant returned once more, this time offering a tray of warm towels. As she handed one to Darius, their eyes met briefly, and he saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of discomfort. Perhaps even guilt. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. She nodded quickly, moving on to the next row. Darius unfolded the towel, the warmth of it seeping into his hands. It was a small thing, a moment of civility in a day marked by tension, but it reminded him that change, however incremental, was possible. As the plane began its descent, Darius looked out the window at the city below, its lights shimmering like a constellation. He thought about the day's events, the torn ticket, the whispers, the unspoken challenges that had followed him from the gate to the cabin. The world was still the same, its prejudices woven into the fabric of everyday life. But sitting there, high above the ground, Darius allowed himself to believe that each confrontation, each small act of defiance, could loosen a single thread. Because change didn't happen all at once. It came in moments, in the cracks and fissures of a system that had stood unchallenged for too long. And Darius Montgomery, tired as he was, would keep pushing at those cracks, widening them one thread at a time. The plane had landed, and the familiar rush of passengers preparing to disembark filled the cabin. But for Darius Montgomery, the journey was far from over. He stepped off the aircraft, his body weary but his mind alert, carrying not just his belongings but the weight of what lay ahead. At the gate, James Lindley, the supervisor from earlier, waited with a tense expression. His usual air of corporate composure seemed strained, like a mask on the verge of slipping. "Mr. Montgomery," he began, "we've arranged for transportation to the airline's headquarters. The CEO, Mr. Ethan Callaway, will be meeting you personally. He's eager to address today's incident and ensure it's resolved to your satisfaction." Darius nodded curtly, signaling his readiness. This wasn't just about today's incident, it was about all the days leading up to it and all the days that would follow. The ride to the headquarters was quiet, the city rushing past in a blur of lights and shadows. Darius sat in the backseat of a sleek black car, his thoughts a swirl of frustration and resolve. He thought about the gate attendant, her smirk as she tore his ticket. He thought about the businessmen in the lounge, their dismissive whispers about the race card. And he thought about the countless times he'd been forced to navigate these same undercurrents, always balancing the need to stand firm with the burden of proving his humanity. The headquarters loomed ahead, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to rise out of the ground like a fortress. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, the walls adorned with art meant to evoke modernity and inclusivity. But Darius had learned long ago that appearances were often the first layer of deception. He was escorted to a conference room where Ethan Callaway waited, flanked by a small team of executives. Callaway was a tall man with the polished demeanor of someone who spent his days managing crises. His handshake was firm, his smile measured, and his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. "Mr. Montgomery," Callaway said, gesturing for him to sit, "thank you for meeting with us. On behalf of the airline, I want to express my sincerest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you experienced today. Darius sat down but didn't immediately respond. He wanted to see where this would go, how far they were willing to take their regret before it ran up against the wall of self-preservation. We've reviewed the incident thoroughly. Calloway continued, his voice smooth and rehearsed. I assure you, the behavior of the gate attendant does not reflect our company's values. Darius leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. What are your values, Mr. Calloway? He asked, his tone calm but pointed. Calloway hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Well, we strive to provide exceptional service to all our customers. Regardless of what? Darius interrupted, leaning forward slightly. Race? Gender? Income? Tell me, Mr. Calloway, do you believe that's true? Or is that just the line you give in meetings like this? The tension in the room thickened, the executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Calloway cleared his throat. I understand your frustration, Mr. Montgomery, and I assure you, we are taking this very seriously. The gate attendant has been removed from her position, and we are implementing additional diversity training to prevent incidents like this in the future. Training, Darius repeated, the word laced with skepticism. And what happens when the training ends? What happens when someone else, in another uniform, decides they can play judge and jury based on a glance? Will you be here then, offering another apology? Calloway's confidence wavered, his polished exterior beginning to crack. What would you suggest, Mr. Montgomery? He asked, his tone more subdued now. Darius took a deep breath, his voice steady but heavy with conviction. Start by owning the problem. Publicly. Acknowledge that this isn't an isolated incident but part of a culture that allows bias to go unchecked. Then commit to dismantling that culture not just with training, but with accountability. Hire people who reflect the diversity of the customers you claim to serve. Promote people who challenge the status quo, not those who reinforce it. And when someone crosses the line, don't just shuffle them around. Show them, and the world, that there are consequences. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the table like a fog. Calloway exchanged a glance with one of his executives, a woman seated at the far end of the table. She nodded subtly, as though giving him permission to step into the deeper waters Darius had laid before him. You're right, Calloway said finally, his voice quieter now. We need to do more. And we need to do it now. Darius studied him for a moment, measuring the sincerity behind his words. He wasn't naive, he knew that real change wouldn't come from a single meeting or a polished statement. But this was a start. A crack in the wall that might one day crumble under its own weight. As the meeting concluded, Calloway extended a hand once more. I'd like to work with you on this, Mr. Montgomery, he said. Your perspective could help us create meaningful change. Darius hesitated, then shook his hand. I'll help, he said, but only if you're serious. This isn't about optics, Mr. Calloway. It's about justice. He left the headquarters feeling both exhausted and resolute. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But Darius had never been one to shy away from a fight. As he stepped into the evening air, the city lights reflecting in the glass towers around him, he thought about all the people who had stood in his place before him and all those who would follow. The battle wasn't over, but the first blow had been struck. And for Darius Montgomery, that was enough to keep moving forward. The days that followed were marked by quiet, unrelenting tension. For Darius Montgomery, the incident at the gate was no longer a singular event but a spark that had ignited a broader reckoning. The airline's leadership had promised action, but Darius had seen promises falter before. Buried under the weight of bureaucracy and self-interest, he sat in his home office, staring at the email from Ethan Calloway, the CEO. The message outlined their initial steps: mandatory diversity training, the formation of a council to address systemic bias, and a public acknowledgement of the incident. It all sounded good on paper, polished and deliberate, but Darius couldn't shake the feeling that it was a performance. A calculated response designed to quiet dissent rather than address the root of the problem. That evening, he received an unexpected letter. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unremarkable, but the return address caught his eye. It was from the gate attendant. Darius hesitated, the weight of the envelope heavy in his hand. He tore it open, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The words inside were raw, unpolished, and deeply personal. I don't expect you to forgive me, It began, "But I need you to know how sorry I am. What I did wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. I judged you before I knew anything about you. And I acted on that judgment in a way that hurt you and everyone who saw it. I've spent every day since thinking about what it means to truly see someone. And I realize now how blind I've been." Darius read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. It wasn't absolution he sought, nor was it something he could easily give. But the letter was a small fracture in the wall of prejudice the woman had built around herself. It was a beginning. The following week, Darius was invited to attend the first meeting of the airline's newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Council. The meeting took place in a sleek conference room, its walls lined with photos of the airline's history, photos that, Darius noticed, were conspicuously lacking in diversity. Ethan Calloway opened the meeting with a statement of intent. "This council represents our commitment to change," he said. "We're here to listen, to learn, and to take meaningful action." Darius listened, his skepticism tempered by the faint hope that this time might be different. As the discussion unfolded, he saw glimpses of both resistance and progress. Some executives spoke earnestly about their desire to address systemic issues, while others clung to their defensiveness, their words carefully chosen to avoid admitting fault. At one point, an older executive raised a familiar objection. "We need to be careful," he said, his tone measured. "We can't alienate our core customers by being too heavy-handed with this." Darius couldn't stay silent. "Heavy-handed?" he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Do you think the woman who tore my ticket thought twice about how heavy-handed her actions were? Do you think the passengers who watched it unfold felt comfortable with the message it sent about who belongs here and who doesn't?" The executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dropping to the table. "This isn't about alienating anyone," Darius continued. "It's about making this company and this country a place where people don't have to fight for the dignity they should already have." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. For a moment, Darius wondered if he'd gone too far, if his honesty would push them further into their defensiveness. But then Ethan Calloway nodded. "He's right," Calloway said, his voice firm. "If we're serious about change, we have to confront these issues head-on. It won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable, but it's necessary." The meeting continued, the conversation shifting toward actionable steps. Darius outlined a proposal for more inclusive hiring practices, mentorship programs for underrepresented employees, and a public commitment to accountability. By the end of the session, he felt a cautious optimism, a sense that perhaps, this time, the cracks in the foundation might widen into something transformative. As he left the headquarters that evening, Darius reflected on the day's events. The fight for justice was rarely linear, and progress often came in frustratingly small increments. But the letter from the gate attendant, the conversations in the meeting, these were signs that the walls were beginning to shift. Yet, he knew the road ahead would be long. The challenges weren't just in boardrooms and conference calls. They were in the hearts and minds of people who had been conditioned to see the world through the lens of bias. Changing that would take more than policies and training. It would take courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Darius walked into the evening air, the city lights glinting in the windows of the towering buildings around him. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it all, the history, the struggle, the endless push for a better world. And then he squared his shoulders, ready to keep fighting, because the cracks were there. And if he had anything to say about it, they would keep growing. The air inside the packed auditorium was heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes something both meaningful and irreversible. Darius Montgomery stood backstage, the low hum of murmured conversations filtering through the curtains. The airline had invited him to deliver the keynote at a press conference announcing their new initiatives to combat systemic bias, initiatives he had helped shape over months of grueling meetings. Uncomfortable truths, and fragile progress. As he waited for his cue, Darius reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The torn ticket, the whispers in the lounge, the tension in the boardroom, each moment a thread in a larger tapestry of struggle and resilience. He thought about the people who had stood silently by, the ones who had spoken up, and the ones who had refused to see. He thought about the gate attendant's letter, her halting acknowledgement of a prejudice she could no longer deny. Most of all, he thought about the countless others, those who might never step into a first-class cabin, who might never have the chance to demand accountability in a corporate boardroom. but who deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity nonetheless. The moderator's voice broke his reverie. And now, it is my great honor to introduce Mr. Darius Montgomery, whose courage and vision have inspired us all to take a hard look at ourselves and strive for a better, more inclusive future. The applause was polite but cautious as Darius stepped onto the stage. He scanned the audience, a sea of faces ranging from corporate executives to journalists, employees to customers. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with skepticism, and a few with the kind of respect that came from understanding the weight of his fight. He began simply, his voice calm but firm. When I boarded a flight a few months ago, I didn't expect to become the center of a controversy. I didn't set out to make headlines or spark debates. I was just trying to get where I needed to go, like all of you. But what happened at that gate wasn't just about me. It was about a system that sees some people as passengers and others as problems. It was about a culture that allows assumptions to dictate actions, no matter the cost to the person on the other side of them. The room grew quieter, the weight of his words settling over the audience. I'm not here to talk about what happened to me, he continued. I'm here to talk about what it revealed about the walls we build between us, the stories we tell ourselves to justify them, and the quiet ways those walls and stories hurt us all. I'm here to talk about what happens when we decide those walls don't define us, and when we take them down, one brick at a time. He paused, letting the silence stretch, then pressed on. This airline could have ignored what happened. They could have buried it under apologies and policies no one followed. But they didn't. They chose to confront it, not perfectly, not without resistance, but with a commitment to doing better. And that commitment isn't just theirs. It's mine. It's yours. It's all of ours. The applause that followed was louder this time, more genuine. Darius glanced toward the back of the room and saw the young woman who had recorded the gate incident. She nodded at him, her expression a mix of pride and encouragement. After the event, Darius lingered as the crowd began to disperse. Calloway approached him, his usual polished demeanor tempered by a new humility. You spoke beautifully, Calloway said. Words are only the beginning. Darius replied. The work comes next. Calloway nodded, understanding the weight of the statement. I know, and I won't let this be just another initiative that fades into the background. As Darius turned to leave, he was stopped by a familiar figure, the gate attendant. She was out of uniform, her posture tentative but her gaze steady. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice soft but resolute. Not for letting me off the hook, but for holding me accountable. I've learned more in these past few months than I have in my entire career. Darius studied her, seeing not the woman who had torn his ticket but someone struggling to rebuild her own sense of self. Change isn't easy, he said, but it's worth it. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I won't forget that. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Darius felt the weight of the day begin to lift. The fight wasn't over, it never truly was. But this moment, this small victory, was a reminder of what was possible. He thought about the people who had supported him, the ones who had doubted him, and the countless others who would face their own versions of his journey. The ripple he had started wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to everyone willing to see the cracks in the foundation and work to make them wider. And as Darius walked into the night, the city alive with the hum of possibility, he knew one thing for certain: the wave was coming.